The following paper was presented to the Reformation Bible Society on August 2nd, 2025, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. For more information about the Society, please visit their website at reformationbiblesociety.org.
Welcome back, brethren, for the fourth plenary lecture. It's my delight now to introduce to you our speaker, the Reverend Jonathan D. Arnold, who will speak on a name that we've heard at least a couple times now, Herman Hoskier, and the text of Revelation. Reverend Arnold is the General Secretary of Trinitarian Bible Society. He studied at the London Reformed Baptist Seminary. He also has a Bachelor of Law degree with honors from Open University in Milton Keynes. And he serves as the pastor of Westminster Baptist Church in London, England. Welcome to Grand Rapids, all the way from the UK. We're delighted to receive you, brother.
Thank you. It's a joy to be with you all. And as we look at Mr. Hoskier, we trust it will be a profitable endeavor. Maybe you've heard of Herman C. Hoskier. He is a man who is quoted quite a lot in those who would stand for the received text, and there's a lot of useful material that he provides us. I would also say he is a man that has his flaws, and I'll mention why that's the case a little later. So I hope in this paper to consider Herman Hoskier, a bit about him as a person, about his publications, and then his primary publication, which was concerning the text of the Apocalypse, and then consider 5 things as to his methodology and 5 conclusions that we should draw from his work and him as a person. Herman Hoskier is a man who no doubt had great diligence in his personal life. He was born in 1864 and died in 1938. He was a unique figure in that his studies were not conducted under any academic institution, but in many ways he was an independent who had the means to be able to travel and do his own study. He was born into a wealthy family as the son of his father, who was Herman Hoskier as well. His father was a prominent banker and investor, and this led to Herman C. Hoskier, the man we're talking about today, retiring or leaving his banking career at the age of 30, and then being able to endeavor in various forms of his study. This freedom enabled him to pursue specialized research on the text, and I think where it is particularly helpful is we find him as a differing voice from the likes of Westcott and Hort and their theories that were being presented in those days, being no longer shaped by some of the academy at the time. We find Hoskier offers to us a different opinion. His work is quite remarkable on the book of Revelation, where he would travel and take photographs of all the manuscripts, minuscules and so on that he had opportunity to read, so much so that he writes in the first volume in concerning the Apocalypse this: I do not feel that I am under any obligation to the public or private libraries, the authorities of which have allowed their MSS to be photographed at my expense, as this is an insurance on their part against destruction of such records by fire, and I have had to provide such libraries as a rule with 2 and sometimes 3 copies of each MS, which copies are probably kept apart from the MSS themselves. But I am, of course, under considerable obligations to the librarians of these institutions. So here we have this man. He's quite independent. He can go and travel, hindered by war at various points, but able to go and view these manuscripts in person. There were a number of interesting anecdotes to Hoskier. He tried to sell some coins to the US Mint, but was refused. His son was one of the first Americans to be killed in World War I as he joined the Foreign Legion, but we find this man of a very independent mind. What then of his publications? Well, he devoted his life pretty much to collating and critiquing New Testament manuscripts, especially the Apocalypse or Revelation. His early work included the full collation of the Codex 604 in 1890, and that was followed by a study he conducted of the printed editions of Stephanus, Beza, and Elzevir, which sought to trace the formation of the printed Greek New Testament that we know as the Textus Receptus. And these all laid the groundwork for his later magnum opus concerning the text of the Apocalypse. What distinguishes Hoskier in his work is not merely the quantity of data that he had access to, but he records it so diligently, so much so that a modern scholar, Garrick Allen, even argues that ECM was preceded by the work of Herman Hoskier because of its comprehensiveness, and even makes the observation that Hoskier's work is more comprehensive than ECM because he details every single thing that he had seen and not grouping together, as I believe is the case in some of the ECM considerations. A major part of Hoskier's arguments in some of his writings was his devastating comparison of Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus in the four Gospels, where he noted the hundreds of differences you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and over 1,000 in the Gospel of John. And these there contradict the assumption that is still prevailing today that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are the chief representatives of the text that we should follow. The point is easily inferred. How can we trust these two as a foundation when they disagree with each other so frequently? His criticism of the modern critics of his day was on the instability of their preferred manuscripts. While saying that, his position on the received text is one that is strong but also a little flaky. I would summarize his position really as someone who default would be the received text, but he also had reconstructionist tendencies. And so you find that in part of his words on Revelation, where sometimes he'll prefer something that isn't in the received text, and other times he will defend it. He also more generally argues that the scribes of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus were careless. And if you read his work, he sort of sets scribes into three categories. Those who are really careless, and you might as well just throw away their work, because even in the small things you just see how bad they were as scribes. The middle category, where it's just about acceptable, and then diligent scribes, as he would term them. And so Hoskier would view the scribes of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus as not reliable scribes. He also put forward the argument that both of those, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, had been influenced by some early polyglot Bible. And so the Coptic translation was accompanied that, and that had some influence on both of those. And modern scholars disagree with his argument, but that was his position that he set forward as a possible reason as to why there's so much differences between the TR and Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Hoskier's approach was shaped by this blend of preferring the TR but also having some reconstructionist tendencies. He interacted with a lot of the well-known advocates of the received text of the day, or those who were sympathetic to it, such as Scrivener, and he greatly valued Scrivener's work on Stephanus' 1550 edition. And likewise, although Bergam, I think, was the generation before, he also valued Dean Bergen. And as we're here, Otis Fuller mentions in his book, Which Bible?, an encounter between Hoskier and Bergen. And let me just read the account. This is Hoskier speaking. 3.5 years ago, I was in Dean Bergen's study at Chichester. It was midnight, dark and cold without. He had just extinguished the lights, and it was dark and getting cold within. We mounted the stairs to retire to rest, and his last words of that night have often rung in my ears since. As surely as it is dark now, and as certain as the sun will rise tomorrow morning, so surely will the traditional text be vindicated, and the views I have striven to express be accepted. I may not live to see it. Most likely I shall not, but it will come. Very interesting quote from Bergen to Hoskier. And so, along with Bergen, Hoskier was highly critical of Westcott and Hort and their preference for certain textual families, elevating what in those days was called the Alexandrian text type of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus as a mistake. He again says this in his first volume concerning the text of the Apocalypse. He points out that to follow Westcott and Hort, we take a step backwards. But then he says, to restore the Textus Receptus, some of the readings removed from it, on the one hand by changes in accordance with Aleph Sinaiticus, or on the authority solely of Alexandrinus. And so if you read volume 1 of his work concerning the Apocalypse, you'll see lots of support and strong words for the received text. In terms of the other work that he engaged in, he wrote on concerning the genesis of the versions of the New Testament. He wrote on a number of different codexes, and in the eventual paper I'll set out the works that he was engaged in. So that's his publications. Let's turn a little more to his primary work concerning the Apocalypse. This remains one of the most exhaustive textual collations of the book of Revelation ever produced. It is held across 2 dense volumes. I don't believe that they are published today, but you can get them online for free in PDF form in archive.org. And so in that you'll see he offers a comprehensive digest of the manuscript readings, but also evaluates the Greek text of the Apocalypse, one which he seeks to confirm the credibility of the received text, but as I've already said, in some cases questions it. In volume 1, he sets out his approach, analysis of different approaches to Revelation, and how his approach was correct. This work that he conducted was so massive in scope, he personally collated and examined all available Revelation manuscripts up to that were available in 1918. His work was published in 1929, and it had taken him over 30 years of work in order to compile this work concerning the Apocalypse. It included all Greek unseals of Revelation then known that he could get access to, Codex Alexandrinus and others, over 200 Greek minuscules with extensive data for manuscripts such as 1, 61, 69, 94, 1006, 1611, 1854, among many others. What also we find, though, in Hoskier's work is he brings in lectionary readings, over 90 Latin manuscripts, including the Old Latin and Vulgate. He consults numerous Syriac witnesses, the Peshitta, and also Coptic versions. He also quotes from a wide range of patristic sources as well. And he comes to this conclusion actually on the received text. He says this: whatever its imperfections may be, the received text will be found by anyone who takes the trouble to make a tabulation that it is nearer the text of Hippolytus than those of Aleph, and then he names a number of different manuscripts, and he concludes we have not got a bad text. Well, what's the significance of that quote? It's nearer the text of Hippolytus. Well, some of you know Hippolytus of Rome in around 226, so before Sinaiticus, quotes quite extensively from two passages in the book of Revelation, from two chapters. And Hoskier completed an analysis of this in comparison to Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus. And he found that Hippolytus' quotes differ from the TR 15 times, Alexandrinus 22 times, and Sinaiticus 24 times. And so he seeks from that to make the strong argument that we should be following the TR. In fact, he says this: "We have been told that we must not compare with the Textus Receptus, but with some other and more reliable standard, as if we could get a more reliable standard. I notice even Lake uses Lloyd, but also Tischendorf and other standards, and Gregory uses Pickering because it was vest pocket size for his journeys. This is a pernicious method. Each of us ought to use one common standard for our comparisons, and that standard, in use for over 350 years, is Stephen's edition of 1550. And so he's arguing this should be the base for the activity of Westcott and Hort and others. Then in volume 2, it spans around 900 pages, and it provides a verse-by-verse collation of all available Greek manuscripts, as I said, with the 1550 Stephanus said at the top. And it then sets out the different options. Frustratingly, in my view, he doesn't offer as much comment on the content there as I think would be helpful, but it's a useful cataloguing of these things. And so we don't get much critical comment from him. However, as I think has already been mentioned here, Edward Hills cites Hoskier on a number of occasions, especially with regard to Revelation, and it's in this book that is at the bookstand, the Kept Pure bookstand, especially in the verses that were mentioned a short while ago, such as those verses that we're told Erasmus just consulted the Latin on. Hoskier argues that Erasmus did have a codex 141, which I believe was recategorized by Alain to current day 2049. And so he argues that there was some access to a Greek text. There's a whole separate story around whether 2049 is a separate text, but it's sufficient to say that he points to some different evidence. You'll also find Hills directs us to Hoskier and his work on Revelation, stating it's a monumental commentary on Revelation, which takes the Textus Receptus as its base. And Hills says, here we see that the only typographical error worth noting occurs in Revelation 17:8, where we read the beast that was and is not and yet is, which is an interesting view of that particular verse. And so you'll find his analysis, and there is one passage in Revelation which he assesses and which critics, as Hills points out, rather inconsistently blame Erasmus that he didn't change it to the Vulgate reading. And that is Revelation 22 verse 14a, where it speaks of currently, blessed are they that do his commandments. Here, according to Hoskier, Aleph, Sinaiticus, and A, Alexandrinus, and a few Greek minuscule manuscripts read that they wash their robes, and a few other manuscripts say have washed their robes. But the vast majority of Greek manuscripts would have that traditional reading of to do his commandments, and I understand that this is obviously a big change. Rather than to do his commandments, it reads have washed their robes. So let me just consider 5 things about the methodology of Hoskier. First, I would say he gives an exhaustive collation, which is helpful to us. He also provides a lot of reference for version or version inclusion that we can reference and look to in support of the received text. He integrates a lot of patristic writers as well. He also rejects the shibboleths that are put up even by modern academics today. The old shorter reading is better. Hoskier argues vociferously against that. He writes on one occasion, "New methods do not clarify, they impose more work on the student." And so he was very keen to identify that. And as I've already mentioned, he was keen to have a sense of following that tradition, that text that had been used for many years before Westcott and Hort came and interfered. Now, just lastly, I want to turn to 5 things that we can observe from Hoskier. And one of them, I hope I haven't inflated your view of Hoskier too much, because whilst Hoskier was very diligent in his work, and you might say very charitable towards the received text, he was a man in his own theology that had his problems. I learnt a new phrase today from someone in the short papers that said the Lord sometimes uses straight licks from a crooked stick. I think I got that phrase correct. And Hoskier would be one of those, because his own theology, especially later on in his life, is deeply troubling. You can read a book he wrote on immortality, which would seem to point towards views of the metaphysical that would be purely unbiblical. He would hold to some form of reincarnation, possibly, on the basis of those writings. And so we have to take a very big caveat when we look at this man's work. Yes, he's helpful to us, but we shouldn't just blind ourselves to other things that he has written. And so you can look up that for yourself. It's not a particularly profitable read, but if you look up his work on immortality, you'll see the problems that we have with this man. That's the first thing, to get the more negative aspect out the way. He also, as a man who was relatively independent, gives a scholarly view in that day outside the academy. His tone was often abrasive, and so he would alienate some, but sometimes that is necessary. He also attacked Westcott and Hort, who he accused of relying on an infinitesimal section of manuscripts. And also he referred to the preference for Vaticanus and Sinaiticus as old bosh. Bosh being from the old Turkish word which means just empty. So he calls away from that quite rightly. Secondly, some have pointed out that he was, of course, writing during the midst of World War I, and some have sought to explain some of his views away because of certain views of the Revelation that would connect to what was going on in that time in World War I, such as in Revelation 8, verse 9. Thirdly, you find that he is taken up by some advocates of the majority text, but that is misplaced, because at various times he adopts minority readings. Let me give you a few examples. In Luke 11, verse 52, he takes up a minority reading. Acts 2, verse 24, Matthew 17:20, Matthew 17:25, Luke 23:8. And here he's selecting minority reading. So he's not sort of a pro-TR person that's purely heading towards a majority text. He would prefer minority readings as well. For some reason, Dan Wallace seemed exceptionally exercised to point out that Hoskier was not a majority text advocate in an article that he wrote on Hoskier and the majority text as well. He seeks to separate Hoskier from Scrivener and Hills in that regard, which is maybe an interesting article for you to read. And so you see in this passage that Hoskier is a flawed man. but he's a man that gives us much help when it comes to the text. Gives us so much information, and is that voice. We might say he's a flawed friend of the received text. He, in many ways, is a paradox, that he presents to us this TR position as the default, but encourages some reconstruction of it. And so hopefully that's given you a little taste of Hoskier that you might pick up and read concerning the text of the Apocalypse. It might take you a little while to get through it, and volume 2 is probably better for a reference, I would suggest. If you're looking at a particular verse on Revelation, look up Hoskier and the various manuscripts and so on that he cites. And so we can use him because his work has been regarded by scholars. In fact, let me just conclude with this. He cites a number of manuscripts that have subsequently been destroyed. One particular manuscript they thought was destroyed during World War II in Dresden, but through Hoskier's notations, they were able actually to find that particular manuscript. So his diligence in the manuscript recording is something that remains helpful to us all. Thank you very much.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend Arnold, for a fascinating presentation. I trust that all of our appetites are whet to dig more into this important figure and his work, even as he is a flawed friend to us advocates of the traditional text. Thank you as well, Reverend Arnold, for your labors, which I trust in the Lord are not in vain through TBS. I'd be so bold as to even pray that the Lord would bring about that day that Dean Bergen hoped for, that like the rising of the sun, the traditional text would be vindicated in God's good timing.